Welcome to the VMware Multi-Cloud Podcast. My name is Eric Nielsen, and on the show today, we're going to be talking about DevOps and VMware Cloud Management. David Jasso, my co-host, is here. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Eric. Hey, and everybody we have with us, we're fortunate to have with us today Mandy Storbakken. Mandy is the Senior Technical Manager leading Emerging Business Solutions Architects, so she's out in our field, and she's part of a Cloud Management Center of Excellence team. Mandy's going to be telling us about, we're going to be talking about DevOps and then also talking about how that maps directly to some of the offerings we have in cloud management. But before we get there, I'd like to ask Mandy just to introduce herself and tell us about what she's doing now and what she's done, some of the other roles that she's had in her career as well. Thank you, Mandy.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everybody. Excited to be here. As David said, I'm Mandy Storbakken. I have literally just moved, or I'm in the process of moving into this new role back in the field in our Cloud Center of Excellence, leading the solutions architects, as David mentioned. Prior to that, today or maybe last week, I was a cloud technologist evangelist in the cloud management business unit for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was a cloud management specialist SE in the field, so selling cloud management solutions as the systems engineer to our customers. Prior to that, I was actually a customer myself, so I implemented private and hybrid cloud solutions at a couple of rather large medical device companies. And then before that, I was still working in enterprises across Unix and virtualization and automation and cloud. So I've done a little bit of everything in IT, and I'm excited to be moving into this new role, literally starting now. So I'm happy to be here to share some of my experiences and my perspectives with David and Eric and all of you as well.
Hey, cool. Hey, and you remember you talking about the fact that you started as a Unix admin, I think, in some of the early roles. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me that this month, and it's actually a specific day, but we've made it into a month, is sysadmin month. Yeah. So we're celebrating that. So shout out to all the sysadmins and especially to all the virtual admins that are out there. Hey, Mandy, you and I go back a long time. We met years ago when I was part of a cloud management business unit. But you've done a lot of writing on DevOps. In fact, I've been at some DevOps Days with you, and I know it's been an interest for a long time. Maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of how you came to have an interest in the DevOps space.
Yeah, so I actually wrote one of my blog posts actually talks to this too, that I know that we're probably going to link to some of them. So one of them specifically talks about DevOps Days. And so there was a DevOps Days locally, I don't remember, 2016, something like that. And I went, I go to, if there are local conferences, I'll go. I travel a lot as well, and I do like to stay in town for things. And I was just really taken aback by the culture and the enthusiasm of the movement and the people that were involved. And one thing that I've noticed through going to many of these DevOps Days conferences across the country now is that each market has a different makeup of attendees at some of these conferences. But the one in Minneapolis, which was one of the larger ones, did have a lot of sysadmins and developers and programmers as well. And I think coming from the sysadmin side of things, we tended to be a little bit, at least back then, intimidated by some of these concepts and believed it to be more a space of just pure software developers or programmers. And what going to this DevOps Days conference showed me was that not only is this a movement where we are collaborating across Dev and Ops, as is in the name, to try and improve things, but also it's a very open, welcoming community, very considerate of different people's needs. There was accommodations made for mothers that were nursing and wheelchair access to things, and speakers across every kind of different level of experience, completely new to the field, to those that had been working for a lot longer. And I just felt that it was so welcoming and enthusiastic and growing, emerging, that I fell in love with it and just wanted to know more and wanted to be a part of it, really.
Yep, I love DevOps Days. Besides the all the content that's like very specific DevOps, they also have usually a set of very eclectic stuff that is just interesting in its own right and has some tangentially related to DevOps, but it's just fascinating. So I really enjoyed the DevOps.
Yeah, not your typical tech conference. And as you already mentioned, I was a Unix sysadmin for many years, and so I've been to many tech conferences, starting with various different Unix ones up to 2 decades ago, and completely different experience. So I'm a big fan of the movement.
Hey, we want to talk a little bit about, and then we're going to get into a focus about cloud management and VMware specifically. But you've got a long history, a lot of expertise in the area of cloud management, and so that also involves IT ops, kind of traditional IT ops. You've seen that. Maybe you can talk about how is IT ops, as a lot of people would understand it, different from what DevOps is? Because I think there's often a lot of confusion around how those things are the same and different.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ops these days too. One of the other things that I blog on, as you know, David, is around this concept of a cloud operating model. And, DevOps was a name that not only makes sense because we are collaborating with, development teams and operations, moving, the both pieces into the software development lifecycle and just working much more closely together. But it also had a great name that had a zing to it. So DevOps, yeah, sounds great. We love it. I'm going to use it. And then since then, of course, we've gone a little nuts in that space. We have AI ops, we have DevSecOps, we have just SecOps, cloud ops, we have all kinds of ops. And at the end of the day, it's all, I think different companies call these teams different things, but operations is essentially operating the application from the time that it goes into production and through maintenance until it's retired, and that's IT ops, traditional IT ops, the infrastructure teams, the infrastructure silos, network, compute, storage, and even middleware teams and some of those kinds of things. And then dev is the application development and writing the updates and releasing the updates, and so IT ops is more the traditional way of doing things. And then we talk about a cloud operating model as being a way of changing the way that you do operations, not just people process, but also technology around being much more efficient around your use of cloud technologies and just newer technologies in general. And then DevOps, I think, is very closely related, but it's really around the application space. So it starts and ends with the application. The application is at the center of the DevOps lifecycle, and it's just making all of those pieces far less disjointed and making the operations phases and roles a true part of the application lifecycle, and not just something that's bolted on at the far end. So that's a little bit long-winded, but there's lots of something ops out there, and I think they're all connected, and they're all looking to do similar things. But that's how I look at those different things.
So Mandy, it's interesting. I've watched this kind of mature for the last 5 or 7 years as well. And when I first got into it from an IT perspective, because I definitely am IT perspective, I was an admin, Linux admin, Sun Microsystems admin, that whole thing. I looked at DevOps as this way that I was going to have to learn developer practices, to more integrate with developer, because I was looking at it from an IT perspective and trying to figure out how the modern developer is actually deploying into clouds, whether it be Amazon or other ones. But then you talk to developers, they're actually looking at it from a standpoint. I think they looked at a standpoint at the beginning, just how do I get deployed into a cloud? But now as it's maturing, it becomes how do I actually control the operations of complex environments? And they're kind of meeting in the middle. I find like the ops, whether it's dev or IT, it's kind of like it's the same topic. It's just which perspective you're actually looking from the developer or from the IT. But there's this sweet spot in the middle where we're just trying to make the applications work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, originally I felt the same way coming from the sysadmin side of the house. we had done things with scripts and, scripting repeatable tasks and, could script our way out of a paper bag, but we didn't have the software development background or discipline to really write scalable, supportable code to do things. And I think we were all a little bit intimidated by that. And at the same time, sysadmins, developers oftentimes said, I'm not really interested in infrastructure. I don't want that to be part of my role. I like writing features and functionality. And so there was a lot of, for a long time, it was kind of looked at as very black and white in that you're either one or the other, or you're going to be doing both. The DevOps person writes the application and supports the application. And actually, it's much more of a continuum and just making sure that folks are working much more closely together. But also, not everybody doesn't have to do everything to do with the life cycle. It's great that if you are a little broader and you understand the different pieces of the life cycle, but it doesn't mean that somebody that was traditionally a development person is now going to be, swapping out hard drives. It doesn't necessarily go that way. And there's one of my cloud operating model blog posts or DevOps ones, I can't quite remember, is on this concept of shift left. And so that to me is something that understanding how that worked made it a lot clearer where organizations are taking this, because there's of course the theory that comes out early. This is what we think we should do, and this is what works in a very small subset of organizations that have attempted to do this. And then there's how it works in practice across the enterprise. And so shift left to me, when talking to early customers, especially on the sysadmin side or the security side, would say, well, we don't want to shift security functions into the hands of the developers because the subject expert matter is here, or the subject expertise is here, and it's not that we don't trust them, but that it's not really their bag.
It's not that we don't trust them, but we don't trust them.
Well, it's yeah. All right, fine. And so one of the things about shift left for me is that no, you don't have to. You're not handing over responsibility. You can take processes that were typically bolt on after the application had gone live and move them earlier in the process through providing those capabilities in an automated, safe way to the developer to incorporate into the lifecycle earlier, where you can catch issues earlier, where they're cheaper to resolve and easier to resolve, and all those kinds of things. So it's not an all on or nothing. It's more taking the best practices from both sides and making a better approach to software lifecycle management.
Yeah, I love the saying shift left, because I think it really is sort of the sort of contrary to sort of that an older saying, which was, people would throw things over the wall, right? So it's like, development would happen and then you'd throw it over the wall to IT ops and they would take it over. And so this concept of shift left says that's not the model. You take the operations and you embed them as part of the development process. Right. So there is no wall anymore, right? And, you've written about this sort of some of the characteristics of that is that you just have much higher collaboration between teams and also much higher empowerment. Those teams are now empowered to do whatever is necessary to build the best application, but also one that will run the best as well.
Right, and, absolutely, but without the traditional operations teams kind of washing their hands of it and saying this is your problem now. That's not shift left.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's great. Hey, one of the things you've also written about is this idea of like what are some of the best practices around impact of DevOps, and there's it's kind of because it's not easy to measure, right? How do you think about like we're doing DevOps, but how do we know it's working, and what should we be measuring? Maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of like how people should be thinking about measuring the impact of DevOps, and then we'll transition to thinking about what does it mean in practical terms around cloud management.
Yeah. So in kind of in the most pure sense of DevOps, it's really, of course, it's the application lifecycle. And so one of the really best books out there, which David, I know you and I've talked about already, on to me on DevOps just in general that I've read, because I love to read about theory, but really I'd like to see in practice how did this actually work, is the book Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren and some other researchers who looked at what are the metrics that, well, first of all, they wrote about how they did the research behind their State of DevOps report, which is a yearly report, which is fascinating, not only to see how it's grown through the years in which since they've been doing this report, but also in the ways that it's morphing. But they went into detail about how they did their research. But as they went through this research, they found that 4 things correlated to high-performing organizations. And it didn't matter what else you had or measured or improved. If you could measure these 4 metrics and you did well on these 4 metrics, that was a very high correlation with a high-performing organization. And they were around very app-centric metrics around lead time for getting from the development cycle, start to finish, deployment frequency, how often you were actually deploying code into production, mean time to restore, restoring after a problem or an outage, and then change fail percentage. How often are you making a change and it's failing and you're having to roll back? Like I said, very, very application focused metrics, but really high correlation with high performing orgs. And so as they went a bit deeper into that, there was things like infrastructure as code that were behind that. The more of your application stack that is stored in a Git repository and is managed as code, and those kinds of things, plays into some of this as well. And so for application teams, pure DevOps teams that manage an actual application, because a lot of people say there's no DevOps team, there's an application team that has follows DevOps principles. There's those which there's lots and lots of things written about already, and then there's teams that are adopting DevOps principles and best practices that are maybe more traditional infrastructure based teams like platform ops and some of those other teams. And so that's more the kind of thing that I write about, because I think there's a lot less information out there for those teams that are trying to take on some of those principles, but don't necessarily own the application or aren't necessarily responsible for an application in enterprises, So there's a huge range of types of teams that are benefiting from DevOps and how they're implementing it in their own environments.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me, because when I think about DevOps and concepts like Agile, to me it's around velocity, it's the ability to produce code, but that's useless unless you're also producing quality. And so when I think about those metrics, they you can see that that's at the heart of them, right? It's like you have to have the ability to deliver quickly, but you actually have to have quality code that doesn't break down and doesn't, if there is an issue, it could be easily resolved, and those sort of goes to all your core processes. So I think those make sense.
And what about all of our enterprise customers and teams that use purely off-the-shelf software that aren't actually involved in the development cycle of the software, but are involved in the operational side, the deployment and the operational side. And Nicole's book also talked to that across all of their studies, it didn't matter what the underlying infrastructure was, or whether it was out-of-the-box software or in-house developed software, but if they were doing well on some of these key metrics, then they have this high-performing org. So it's not limited just to teams that are writing the software and implementing the software themselves. All teams, can benefit from some of these principles, which I thought was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, because you in the world of DevOps and Kubernetes and modern apps and microservices and everything, everybody tends to focus completely on building your own applications. And if you really look at it, an enterprise that has, some of the big enterprises have 2,000 or 3,000 applications. Half or 3/4 of those are not built in-house. But you're just operationally deploying them and managing them. And then how do you manage all that holistically so that you just don't have pockets of DevOps that are for developers, and then the rest of IT doing hybrid cloud environments and having the separation? Bringing those back together requires kind of both of those managed together.
Yes, yes, exactly. I mean, you want to improve those processes too, right? You don't want to be excluded from this movement or this culture because you are buying off-the-shelf software. And the good news is that you don't have to be. These things can apply.
Yeah, I think that's great points from both you. That sort of, and kind of like, if you think about even applications that people build in the cloud, almost nobody builds an entire application from scratch anymore, right? You take a bunch of cloud services, you integrate them, you write some custom code yourself, and whether it's sort of the same model, right? Which is whether it was COTS, common off the shelf, or as a cloud service, it winds up being someone else's software in terms of they wrote it. But you took ownership for it and had to integrate it and make it all work together.
Yeah, I kind of look at this and go, like, careful what you ask for, right? Because I feel like the DevOps, the developers that were moving faster than IT and buying cloud services, and then trying to manage all that through like some of this became very successful, right? They actually became so successful that all of a sudden you start owning more and more of the operational part of it. And I think they started looking at this going, yeah, but that's great, but I don't know if we want to own. So therefore, you do need to bring IT along and have them support that, because the reality is it was fun for a little while, but because you became successful, you actually started becoming ops. And I don't think any developer really wants to be ops.
And it's just like it became something that was done 100 times versus this is the first or second, or now it's like you're on the 1,000th version.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, I don't really want to manage this anymore.
Well, and you have to have a path to take your existing workforce and teams and help them evolve and grow to meet the demands of the new world. So you're not going to go out if you're a top 5 bank. And you're looking to do more DevOps, in your environment. You're not going to go out and just hire a whole bunch of new people to come in and do that for you. You have to meet your teams where they are and help them find a path to the way that you want them to operate in the future. And also they have to be able to drive that themselves. There has to be some grassroots in there too. And so, our organization, I remember talking to one of our leaders early on, and he kind of had an anecdote that resonated with me around, he had typical sysadmins, but said, look, I don't expect you to turn into developers overnight, but I do expect you to start automating things. So, if you have to do it more than once, automate it. You can start out with scripts, but we expect you to continue to grow into this role. And I think that's fair. Bring people along, grow them into these new roles, give them the support and the training and the teams around them that they need to be able to evolve with the practices and with the with the culture.
Yeah, and not only that, but then the interfaces are becoming critical for operations, are becoming critical for the developers to be able to have some amount of interaction and control with, so that you can spin up additional resources, or your app can spin up additional resources. So operations and IT people have to understand what interfaces they're providing to developers now, so that it becomes one big application, right? And that the IT ops control is actually integrated into the application itself, which brings them all together.
Yeah, that's a very good point. One of the other posts that I have out there is around this concept of a provider of IT services and a consumer of IT or cloud services. And one of the things that we believe that we have a unique perspective on, based on our history with enterprise software, is both sides of that. So knowing the capabilities that a DevOps team is going to be looking for, but also understanding what's important to the more traditional platform teams, like security, high availability, those kinds of things. So even if you are not going to be moving into a DevOps team yourself, or even if you're not going to be taking on any DevOps practices or be involved in an application lifecycle as a sysadmin or a traditional IT ops person, your consumers, your DevOps teams, your lines of businesses, your developers are going to be demanding from you the same kind of capabilities that they can get from the hyperscalers. Because if they can go swipe a credit card and get immediate resources, and a VM with the OS installed and all the software that they need to be able to do their job, and you aren't able to provide them with similar service, then that's what they're going to do. And that becomes a very tactical use of cloud by certain teams. And that's what leads to like these spiraling costs and the CIO getting mad because, spend is out the window or off the charts. So DevOps is really important to everybody in the IT organization, even if you're not right at the heart of it and part of that, right at the heart of that application lifecycle. It's still extremely relevant.
Hey, Mandy, maybe we can shift gears a bit and talk, because you've talked about DevOps, it's basically for everyone now, right? I mean, it's, anybody that's involved in operation, anyone involved in application development. It means different things to different people, but maybe we can talk a little bit about cloud management, how it relates, and, very popular for folks to use the DevOps Infinity model to talk about all kinds of things in the DevOps toolchain. Maybe we can sort of focus on some of those areas and talk, just, give some examples of like how the various technologies and, VMware Cloud Management relates to some of the things that are part of the DevOps lifecycle.
Yeah, so the DevOps lifecycle or the DevOps loop that we're talking about kind of has, if you can picture it in your mind, it has the blue half or the common image that people look at, the development half, which is plan, code, build, and test, kind of in blue on one side, and then release, deploy, operate, and monitor on the other side. And that maps into, the life cycle of the application, and it's iterative and it's a continuous loop. And so a lot of organizations will map their tools that they use to the DevOps toolchain. And so for some applications, it will be, application developer specific tooling. But when you look at cloud management and some of the connections that we've made there, there's kind of two sides to it. So for cloud management and vRealize specifically, there are capabilities in our solutions, like in vRealize automation, for example, that directly support that DevOps, all the phases of that DevOps loop. So we have infrastructure as code to be able to programmatically deploy the infrastructure resources that are required for the application. We have a pipelining capability for automated deployment and continuous integration of the application as you develop it. And then we have monitoring components, and we have version control integration and some of those things. So there's kind of two sides to it. There's the capabilities in the cloud management solutions that support the DevOps lifecycle for an application. But even more importantly, for our more traditional sysadmin, IT ops customers and users, there's the concept of using some of these DevOps best practices to manage infrastructure. And so at VMware, we call that DevOps for infrastructure. The hint is in the name. And so we will take some of those best practices and say, okay, do you want to manage your VM template deployment or your OS template deployment in the same way that you would an application, i.e. you make an update to it, you build the template in an automated fashion, you do a test deployment. If everything tests out through your gated test that you've configured in the pipeline, then there's either it automatically is released to production, or there's an approval step where somebody can actually manually go in and approve to move to production. And so we're starting to see much more of these DevOps best practices actually being used for the management of infrastructure components.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It sort of allows you then to integrate whatever you're doing into the larger DevOps picture, right? It's like so it's like using the same practices, everything's as code. So and then it supports those objectives of velocity and quality kind of simultaneously, right? So you can sort of match that infrastructure component to the same speed of everything else that's happening at the app layer, right? That you're building at the
so instead of it being kind of an application lifecycle loop, it becomes a service lifecycle loop, right? If your service is VMs or networking components, you treat it in the same way. And so it is an exciting time in technology with all of these changes, and we've done things in the same way for decades and decades, and now we're really starting to through virtualization and automation, of course, is the is at the base of all of this. It's what's made all of this possible. But with virtualization and automation, we're able to do some really amazing things in a space that maybe had stagnated, I think, for a while in infrastructure.
And it's sort of, cloud was like a forcing function, right? It's forcing everything, sort of created a bit of separation between IT and development for a while, but now it's all coming back together, and it's coming back in a way that is, very noticeably better than what was there before. I think. So,
oh, yeah.
Yeah, David and Mandy, it seems like also because cloud has infinite scalability of resource. I think in the old days, we were constrained by what IT had provisioned, right? And if you wanted to expand services or have dynamic expansion, you had to kind of dynamically expand based on what was available deployed in racks in servers, right? Now with cloud and dynamic, the giant clouds providers, you can have your application acquire more resources in real time, right? And so that's actually created a whole nother area of programming, because all of a sudden I am not constrained by what's actually deployed. I'm constrained only by what big cloud provider has infinite amount of resources. And so the dynamic nature of my application can really take advantage of this unlimited capacity, scaling up and scaling down during times when I'm not using given functionality or load, et cetera. So it's kind of like, by having hyperscaler cloud providers out there that we're building apps for, we have this ability to dynamically control much better than we ever had before.
Yeah, and so the hyperscalers, the cloud providers, basically provided competition for your traditional IT organizations who really had a monopoly over their internal users. They were seen as a cost center, so we were always reducing the budget, and they were always having to cut corners and reprioritize things, and not enough investment. And then the cloud providers came along, and now there's competition. And so not only can the internal users go to the cloud providers, but also the companies started to realize, through this digital transformation that we all talk about all the time, that those differentiators today are coming through technology. Like, it doesn't matter what business you're in, those differentiators and that improved customer value and satisfaction is coming through technology and applications and software. And so, we started to invest in our internal IT departments again. And it's way, way overdue in my mind.
Yeah. It is amazing to watch that role transition where it used to be a cost center. It was something that you want to minimize, to all of a sudden becoming a strategic importance to the business or a part of the product, like whether it's iTunes or Netflix or the digital delivery of all services are now part of the service. You're no longer a cost center. You're part of the main core product that's being delivered to your customer. And all of a sudden investments there pay dividends in increased revenue because it's part of your product.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think it was hard for IT in the beginning with cloud, but I think it fundamentally did a lot of good for everyone, because it forced also the business to think about IT in a different way, because they were paying for it very explicitly, and so they could start to think about the explicit cost, whether it was on premise or not, right? It's like it sort of gave it a value that was never understood when it was simply a cost center. So I think long term that's been a positive trend as well. Hey man, this has been great. Any last thoughts on DevOps? But I do really want to finish off with just telling people about where they can learn more. You've got a ton of great content out there, and maybe you could highlight it, and then we could go off from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I have a blog out there, and I know you'll probably link to it somehow. And so I have, I don't know, probably 15 to 20 posts at this point over the last couple of years. And the perspective that I came to when writing that blog was for me in my sysadmin shoes, a Unix engineer or architect, or a networking engineer, or a Windows engineer that maybe knows PowerShell really well to automate the onesie-twosie tasks, but really doesn't have that software development background, and making DevOps accessible to them, like getting rid of some of the making sure that the terminology is understood, and that making sure that folks start to understand that actually this is a movement that we need you in, we need your involvement in, because we're improving things across the board, not just for our applications and our technology, but also for the people that work in technology by becoming more open and collaborative and better job satisfaction at the end of the day. So that's the position that I took when writing the blog post. There's lots and lots of resources out there for the development side, but I wrote it for our traditional VMware customers and helping them to evolve and take advantage of some of these great best practices that are coming out of the movement.
Cool.
I always ask people,
Sure.
Are you on Twitter? Do you ever get around to tweeting? And I am Googling you now to see if I can happen to find this blog.
Yes. So the blog is on VMware.com, cloud.vmware.com.
I see
David,
it.
You know where that is.
Right.
And I am on Twitter. I'm not really a huge social media person, but I am on Twitter and I will tweet occasionally. And so you can find me out there. I will tweet my blogs when I write them. And actually, as I move from this role into the next, you know, I've blogged a lot on the cloud operating model. I've blogged a lot on DevOps. And as I move into my new role in this emerging business team, my focus is going to become DevSecOps, and I'm going to try and unpick that and see where we can take that and why that's going to be important to the next generation of IT organizations. So I'm excited to get some content released there too.
Yeah, if you just Google VMware Mandy Storbakken, Storbakken, who are just listening on a podcast, you can see her. She's on the cloud blog site, cloud.vmware.com. She shows up as the first major topic out past the ad block. Go check her out. All her blog articles are listed there. And Mandy, it looks like you've gotten a haircut since I've seen you on the cloud blog, because your hair is definitely longer.
Yes. Yeah. If I
you got your COVID haircut.
Yes,
COVID's
I was on another
haircut.
call this morning and they said, you had your haircut, there's quite a difference. And I said, well, since COVID, I just get it cut every 6 months. And so I said, cut it to the same length it was 6 months ago, because I'm not going to be back for 6 months. So this is not a style thing. This is I don't ever get my hair cut anymore since COVID.
There you go. Fantastic.
I thought it was like, COVID's over, I'm going out.
No.
Well, Mandy, you've been fantastic. Possibly we can have you back again, because you're so much fun to interview and listen to. I think it's really neat that one, you're a female, and two, you're in DevOps and in this topic. It's great to hear someone that spend some time at the conferences, because a lot of us in IT just hear about it, but we don't really get to speak to an expert very often. So great to have you come talk to us.
Right. And I'm not necessarily an expert, but what I will say is don't be intimidated. Don't be intimidated by new terminology or gatekeeping. Go get involved, because all of us have something to contribute, no matter where you are in your journey. So get involved. Don't be intimidated.
Yeah. One thing I'll say about DevOps too. I mean, I kind of like when I first started to get involved with it and look at it, it's like, it is intimidating. It just sounds so intimidating, but
right.
You know, when you get the more you get into it, the more it's just like kind of like common sense and the way things always should have been.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
right.
It's like you sort of like realize, yeah, this makes a ton of sense. You know, everything's connected, right? Because that's how the applications are. They are connected. You know, all the life cycle's connected. It's not distinct phases with, you know, so you just hand things over to somebody else. It sort of gets at sort of the core of how people have to do things to be successful. So I love the DevOps movement.
Yeah, and if you're following people on Twitter that are seem to be gatekeeping or are not welcoming or make you feel like you're asking stupid questions, then you're following the wrong people, because there's many more people out there that are happy to give everybody a hand up and improve working in technology for all of us.
Yeah. Awesome. Hey, Mandy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
All right.